I lost everything to the man with whom I built an empire. The night I hit rock bottom, shivering in the back seat of a repossessed sedan, a stranger knocked on my frosty window and handed me the keys to a $68 million fortune. But there was a massive catch. If the man who destroyed me found out, he would legally take half of it. And at that exact moment, he was walking right up behind her. My name is Sophia Hartfield, 33 years old. And until recently, I was a financial auditor who gave up her career to build a real estate tech company for the wrong man. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for. It was 20 degrees outside in a bleak Chicago parking lot. My ex-husband, Richard Montgomery, had just finalized our divorce. Through shady shell companies and a manipulated prenuptial agreement, he kept the entire company we built. He left me with absolutely zero savings, a mountain of manufactured legal debt, and nothing but the clothes on my freezing back. A sharp rap on the glass jolted me awake. Standing under a street lamp was Richard, wearing a tailored overcoat, looking like a triumphant CEO preparing for his public offering. He knocked again, a cruel smirk on his lips. I rolled down the window an inch. "Cozy setup you have here, Sophia," Richard sneered. "I told you that you would end up exactly where you belong. You are always just the background noise to my genius. Enjoy the view from the gutter while I ring the bell on Wall Street next month." I gripped the edge of my thin blanket. Before I could respond, the crunch of footsteps caught our attention. An older woman in a charcoal trench coat approached my car. She possessed an aura of authority. Richard turned with arrogant disdain. "And who might you be, handing out spare change to the homeless?" The woman looked directly at me and spoke in a loud, clipped tone. "Are you Sophia Hartfield?" I nodded slowly. "I am Ms. Carmichael," she announced clearly. "I represent the Paramount Collections Agency. I am here to serve you final notice. This vehicle is scheduled for immediate repossession tomorrow morning, due to defaulting on your legal fees." Richard burst into booming laughter, thoroughly entertained by my absolute misery. "Oh, this is simply too perfect," Richard chuckled, "the great auditor getting her run-down car repossessed. Because I am feeling generous today, let me help you out." He pulled a crisp $100 bill from his clip and tossed it through my window. It landed on my lap like an insult. "Buy yourself a hot coffee and a bus ticket out of my city, loser," Richard said. He gave me a mocking salute and walked away toward his waiting SUV. I watched his taillights disappear, my hands trembling with humiliation. But as soon as his car was out of sight, the atmosphere shifted. Miss Carmichael relaxed slightly. She reached into her coat pocket, but she did not pull out a repossession notice. Instead, she slid a heavy, solid black metal card through the gap in my window. "I am not a debt collector, Sophia," she said quietly. "I am the executive of the estate for your great-uncle Harrison. He passed away 2 weeks ago in New York. You have been named the sole heir to his blind trust. It is currently valued at exactly $68 million. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the black card, unable to comprehend her words. $68 million. However, Ms. Carmichael continued, her tone serious. "There is a strict condition attached to this inheritance. Due to your divorce proceedings, the asset division window does not close for another 6 months. If Richard or his legal team discover you have come into this wealth before that window shuts, they will file a motion to reopen the settlement and claim half of it as marital property. He must never know." I looked down at the $100 bill Richard threw at me, resting right next to a card that held tens of millions. A slow, dangerous realization washed over me. I was not helpless anymore. I was fully armed. "Get a hotel room tonight," Miss Carmichael instructed. "Top floor of the plaza. Use the card." We have work to do tomorrow to secure your future. As she walked away into the shadows, I picked up Richard's crisp $100 bill. I did not feel cold anymore. I felt the heat of an impending war. And finally, I knew exactly how to win. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse suite at the plaza closed behind me, shutting out the biting wind. I stood in the foyer, my worn coat a harsh contrast to the crystal chandeliers and velvet furnishings. Ms. Carmichael was already seated at a massive mahogany dining table, covered in thick legal binders. She motioned for me to sit across from her. Pouring 2 cups of black coffee, she got straight to the point. Your great-uncle Harrison was a brilliant man, Sophia. He watched your marriage deteriorate from afar. He knew Richard was siphoning assets from the real estate technology company you two built together. Harrison established this blind trust specifically to protect you, but we are navigating a legal minefield. I pulled the file closer. What kind of minefield? The worst kind, Miss Carmichael replied, her expression grim. Richard and his corporate lawyers structured your prenuptial agreement perfectly. They buried the clauses that allowed him to walk away with 100% of the company equity. But the true danger lies in the asset division window. Under state law, your divorce settlement is not completely sealed for another 6 months. During this period, either party can file a motion to reopen the case if significant new assets are discovered. My stomach tightened. So, if Richard finds out about the $68 million, he will argue that you knew about the inheritance before the divorce was finalized? She interrupted smoothly. His legal team is ruthless. They will tie this money up in litigation for a decade, and a judge might just award him half of it. For the next 6 months, you cannot buy a house. You cannot buy a new wardrobe. You cannot even be seen drinking a premium latte. As far as Richard, the courts, and the rest of the world are concerned, you are completely broke. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking slightly from the cold, but my mind was sharpening. As a former financial auditor, I understood the power of hidden assets. I had spent years tracking down missing funds for corporate clients. Now, I had to apply those same skills to my own life. I had to become a ghost. I accept the terms, I said firmly. I will play the part of the destitute ex-wife flawlessly, but I need access to a fraction of the funds through an anonymous proxy. I am going to investigate Richard. I want to know exactly how he hid the company equity from me. Ms. Carmichael smiled for the first time, a sharp, predatory smile. I have already set up a shielded offshore account for your operational expenses. Just be careful, Sophia. Richard is arrogant, but he is not stupid. I spent the night in the plush, king-sized bed, my mind racing with strategies. But the reality of my fake poverty hit me hard the very next morning. I took a subway back to the bleak parking lot where I had parked my old sedan, intending to grab the last of my winter clothes from the trunk. When I arrived, my heart sank. A massive, rusted tow truck was backing up to my car. The hydraulic lift was already sliding under the front tires. "Hey, wait!" I shouted, sprinting across the icy asphalt. "You cannot take that. I just need to get my coat from the back." The driver, a burly man in a neon vest, barely glanced at me as he secured the chains. "Sorry, lady. Order came through an hour ago. Bank wants it impounded immediately. You are 3 months behind on the loan Richard stuck you with." I crossed my arms against the freezing wind. "How did you even find it? I parked in an unlisted overflow lot." The driver chuckled, pulling a clipboard from his jacket. "Some hotshot real estate broker called it in. Said he was doing a favor for a buddy. Let me check the name." "Yeah, here it is. DeAndre left his business card to make sure he got the finder fee." The air was knocked right out of my lungs. DeAndre, my own brother-in-law. He was an African-American real estate broker, married to my younger sister, Olivia. DeAndre was obsessed with status, constantly wearing fake designer watches and desperate to climb the social ladder. He idolized Richard's wealth and wanted a piece of his empire. DeAndre sold me out to the repo company just to score cheap points with my ex-husband. My own family was actively participating in my destruction. I stepped back and watched the tow truck drag my only shelter away. I had nothing left but the clothes I was wearing and a black metal card hidden deep in my pocket. DeAndre wanted to play dirty to impress a man who would never respect him. I committed his name to my mental ledger. My family was about to learn that betrayal comes with a steep price. The icy wind ripped through my thin wool coat as I watched the tow truck disappear around the corner. With my phone battery dying and my bank accounts completely frozen by Richard's aggressive legal maneuvers, calling a cab was impossible. I had no choice but to walk. The sky opened up, unleashing a torrential freezing rain that soaked me to the bone within minutes. Every step was a brutal physical reminder of how quickly a life could be dismantled. I walked for 4 miles through the relentless storm, my boots sloshing with freezing water, keeping my mind desperately focused on one single destination, my parents' house in the affluent suburbs. Surely blood had to mean something. Surely my own mother and father would not let me freeze on the streets. I was so incredibly wrong. When I finally dragged myself up the long, manicured driveway of their colonial-style home, I was shivering uncontrollably. I reached the heavy oak front door and rang the bell. I waited, my teeth chattering loud enough to hear. Through the side window, I saw movement. The door creaked open, but only a few inches, held firmly in place by the thick brass security chain. My mother, Beatrice, peered out at me. She was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater, a stark contrast to my dripping, ruined clothes. "Mom, please let me in," I gasped, wrapping my freezing arms around myself. My car was just towed. I need a place to stay for a few days until I figure things out. Beatrice did not unlatch the chain. Her eyes were cold, scanning the driveway behind me to ensure none of the wealthy neighbors were watching this embarrassing spectacle. "Sophia, you cannot be here," she hissed, her voice sharp and irritated. "Richard called us this morning. He warned us that you might try to come crawling back." I stared at her, the freezing rain dripping from my eyelashes. "Richard called you? And you are actually listening to him?" My father, Winston, appeared behind her in the foyer. He would not even meet my gaze. "Sophia, try to be reasonable," Winston said, his voice muffled through the narrow opening. "Richard is the primary investor in the new luxury retirement community we are moving into next year. He made it perfectly clear that if we harbor you or give you a single dime, he will immediately pull his funding and our deposit will be forfeit. We cannot lose our retirement lifestyle over your messy divorce." I felt a physical ache in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold rain. "You are choosing a retirement condo over your own daughter?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "You watched me build that software company with him in our garage. You know he stole it from me." Beatrice sighed dramatically, as if my sudden homelessness was merely an inconvenience to her morning schedule. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Sophia. You should have been a better wife. Maybe then he would not have left you with nothing." Suddenly, the door swung open slightly wider, and a battered, familiar object was forcefully shoved through the gap. It was my old college suitcase. It hit the wet porch with a heavy thud, popping open and spilling a few of my old sweaters onto the soaked welcome mat. "I packed up the last of the junk you left in our attic," Beatrice said. "Take it and go. Richard has eyes everywhere, and we are not risking our financial future for your mistakes." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of my mother's words, another figure stepped onto the porch from the side door of the garage. It was DeAndre. He was leaning casually against the brick pillar, spinning a set of expensive car keys on his finger, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "Looking a little rough today, Sophia," DeAndre mocked, stepping into the porch light. He adjusted his tailored cuff intentionally, flashing a bulky gold watch. Even from a distance, the cheap plating of the fake Rolex caught the light. He had undoubtedly bought it with the finder fee he received for selling out my car location. I looked away from my parents and glared directly at him. "You called the repo company?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. DeAndre chuckled, completely unbothered by my anger. "Don't take it personally, sis. It's just business. Richard is the biggest player in the local real estate market. If doing him a small favor gets me the exclusive listings for his new commercial properties, I'm taking that deal every single time. You have to respect the hustle." He smirked, admiring his counterfeit watch again. "Besides, maybe this little reality check will teach you to stop relying on handouts and get a real job." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the freezing air. My own parents stood silently behind the door, implicitly agreeing with a man who was openly humiliating their daughter on their front porch. The final fraying thread holding my family together snapped cleanly and permanently. The agonizing pain of their betrayal vanished instantly, replaced by a blinding, absolute clarity. They had all made their choice. They looked at me and saw a broken, penniless woman they could step on to get closer to Richard's wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the shivering woman standing on their porch possessed $68 million in liquid assets. I did not cry. I did not argue or beg. I calmly reached down, gathered my wet sweaters from the puddles, and shoved them back into the suitcase. I snapped the rusty latches shut. I looked up at my mother, my father, and finally at DeAndre. "I will never forget this," I said. My voice was no longer shaking from the cold. It was dead calm. "Enjoy the investments." I turned my back on the massive colonial house and walked down the driveway, dragging the heavy suitcase behind me. The rain continued to pour, but I walked with my head held high. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I needed a temporary base of operations, one that fit my current pathetic narrative perfectly, while shielding the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I found exactly what I needed in a crumbling brick building on the industrial edge of the city. The apartment was a tiny, drafty studio on the 4th floor with peeling yellow wallpaper, water stains blooming across the ceiling, and a radiator that clanked loudly but produced almost no heat. The landlord, a gruff man who smelled of stale cigars, did not ask for a credit check or references. He only cared about the 3 months of rent I handed him in damp cash drawn from the anonymous proxy account Ms. Carmichael had established for my operational expenses. To the outside world, and more importantly to Richard's private investigators, I was a defeated woman hiding in a slum. It was the perfect camouflage. But the moment the deadbolt clicked shut, the illusion ended. Over the next 48 hours, a series of discreet delivery vans arrived in the alley behind my building at 2 o'clock in the morning. Men in unmarked uniforms carried heavy, reinforced black Pelican cases up the fire escape. I transformed the center of that dingy studio into $1 million financial command center. I set up 3 massive curved OLED monitors on a folding plastic table. Beneath it sat a custom-built liquid-cooled server rack with military-grade encryption routing my connection through half a dozen international proxy servers. Anyone trying to trace my digital footprint would end up chasing ghosts in Eastern Europe. I purchased top-tier enterprise access to global corporate databases, property registries, and offshore financial records. For the first time since Richard served me those divorce papers, I felt completely in my element. Before I was his supportive wife, before I was the woman who organized his schedules and hosted his investor dinners, I was a senior financial auditor at a top firm. My entire career was built on finding the money that rich, arrogant men thought they had cleverly hidden. I tied my hair back, brewed a pot of cheap coffee on the rusted stove, and sat down at the glowing screens. The clanking radiator faded into the background as I immersed myself in the data. I started with the public filings for Richard's real estate technology company, Montgomery PropTech. During our divorce proceedings, his lawyers presented a heavily audited valuation report, claiming the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. They argued the software development costs had bled the business dry, leaving zero equity to be divided between us. The judge bought it, and I was left with nothing but court fees. But numbers do not lie, and they certainly do not disappear without leaving a trail. I began pulling the raw data from the months leading up to Richard filing for divorce. I cross-referenced vendor payments, payroll ledgers, and venture capital injections. I spent 3 straight days and nights staring at the screens, fueled by caffeine and pure adrenaline, manually rebuilding the company balance sheet from scratch. Then, on the 4th night at 3 o'clock in the morning, I found the anomaly. It was a single, seemingly routine line item buried deep in a quarterly expense report filed exactly 4 weeks before Richard handed me the divorce papers. It was labeled as a technology licensing fee, but the amount was staggering. Millions of dollars in corporate equity had been instantly wiped from the books. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted digital document. Richard had not just paid a fee. He had executed a massive He took the proprietary source code we built, the very software algorithm that made his company valuable, and quietly transferred the intellectual property rights out of Montgomery PropTech. He gutted the company from the inside out just to make it look worthless on paper. That was why I got nothing in the settlement. I furiously typed commands, tracing the destination of that massive transfer. The digital trail twisted through a labyrinth of shell companies in Delaware and Nevada, designed specifically to confuse auditors and investigators. But I knew all these tricks. I had seen them 100 times before. I kept digging, breaking down each corporate layer, following the money as it hopped from one phantom entity to another. Finally, the trail stopped. The core intellectual property of Richard's entire empire was sitting quietly in an anonymous holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. I leaned back in my cheap plastic chair, a cold, hard smile forming on my face. Richard thought he was a genius. He thought he had outsmarted me, the courts, and the entire legal system. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot who built the financial architecture of his business in the first place. I had the thread now, and I was going to pull it until his entire world unraveled. But to get the exact details of that Cayman account, I needed someone on the inside. I needed someone desperate, greedy, and completely unaware of who was pulling their strings. To match the digital trail with real-world conversations, I needed to get close to Richard's daily operations. Through the proxy account, I arranged a generous, untraceable donation to the manager of an exclusive downtown steakhouse, securing a daytime waitressing shift without a background check. It was the exact restaurant Richard used for his high-level investor lunches. The uniform was a stiff white button-down shirt, a black apron, and a pair of cheap rubber-soled shoes that blistered my heels. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the advantage of being invisible. To the wealthy elite, service staff are practically furniture. They say everything out loud. On my 3rd day, the heavy mahogany doors swung open and my stomach plummeted. It was not an investor lunch. Richard strolled in, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. His arm wrapped around his new fiancée, Brittany. She was 24. Dripping in diamonds, paid for by the company I built, and the daughter of one of Richard's largest venture capital backers. Trailing closely behind them, laughing loudly and desperate to fit in, were my sister Olivia and DeAndre. I immediately turned toward the kitchen, hoping to trade tables with another server. But Olivia possessed the sharp, predatory eyes of a scavenger. "Oh my God, Richard, look!" Olivia shrieked, her voice cutting through the elegant dining room. "Is that Sophia?" The entire group stopped. Richard turned, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. He snapped his fingers at the maitre d'. "We want her serving our table. No one else. Make it happen." I took a deep breath. plastered a blank, subservient expression on my face, and grabbed a silver water pitcher. I walked over to their corner booth. The moment I arrived, the psychological assault began. Well, well, Richard purred, leaning back in the leather booth. I heard you were sleeping in a shelter, but scraping plates for minimum wage is a nice touch. It really suits your ambition. Brittany leaned over, peering over the edge of the table at my feet. She let out a high-pitched, theatrical gasp. Oh, honey, look at her shoes. They are literally peeling apart. Richard, you should leave her an extra $5 so she can buy some tape to hold those tragic things together. DeAndre slammed his fist on the table in exaggerated laughter, showing off his fake Rolex again. The irony was suffocating. DeAndre was drowning in debt. Yet here he was, mocking the shoes of a woman who could buy the entire restaurant with a single phone call. I poured their water in absolute silence, my face a mask of stone. What can I get started for the table? I asked evenly. Olivia picked up her full glass of house red wine. You know what, Sophia? I don't think I want wine today. I think I want a different vintage. With a flick of her wrist, she tipped the glass outward. The dark red liquid splashed directly onto my white apron and shattered the glass on the expensive hardwood floor, pulling dangerously close to my cheap shoes. Oops, Olivia said, her eyes gleaming with malice. Clumsy me. You better clean that up before you get fired. On your knees, sister. The restaurant went dead silent. Other patrons watched, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. My hands curled into tight fists. Every instinct screamed to dump the water pitcher over Richard's head and walk out. But the auditor inside me knew better. Emotional reactions ruined strategic plans. I swallowed my pride, grabbed a stack of bar towels, and dropped to my knees amidst the shattered glass. As I scrubbed the red wine from the floorboards, practically invisible beneath the edge of their table, the real reason I took this job presented itself. They forgot I was there. They started talking business. Everything is locked in for the public offering next month, Richard boasted to DeAndre, pouring himself a fresh glass of water. The Cayman transition is holding perfectly. The auditors did not catch a thing during the divorce. The core software is sitting pretty offshore. DeAndre leaned in, his voice dropping slightly. And what about my cut? I moved a lot of paper to hide those property assets for you, Richard. My creditors are breathing down my neck. I need that bonus advanced. I have $500,000 in balloon payments due next week on my condo and the cars. Richard scoffed dismissively. You will get your scraps when the IPO clears, DeAndre. Stop whining. You are embarrassing yourself. Manage your own debt. I paused my scrubbing, my heart racing with triumph. DeAndre was financially desperate. He was drowning in toxic debt. And Richard refused to help him. I found my target. I gathered the broken glass and smiled to myself. I survived the rest of my shift with a quiet, burning energy. Every time Olivia snapped her fingers for more bread, every time Richard laughed his booming, arrogant laugh, I just smiled and nodded. They thought they were breaking my spirit. In reality, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their inner circle. The moment my manager dismissed me, I threw my wine-stained apron into the laundry bin and practically sprinted to the subway. The blistered heels and aching back did not matter anymore. I burst through the door of my crumbling apartment, bypassed the clanking radiator, and immediately powered up my encrypted servers. The glowing screens illuminated the dark room. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. Tracking offshore shell companies required weeks of meticulous forensic accounting. But tearing apart the personal finances of a flashy, incompetent real estate broker like DeAndre took me exactly 45 minutes. DeAndre presented himself as a top-tier luxury broker, but his digital footprint told a story of absolute financial desperation. I pulled his credit reports, property deeds, and public tax liens. His life was a complete fabrication built on predatory lending. The luxury downtown condo he shared with my sister Olivia was heavily mortgaged. He had taken out a massive subprime loan just to afford the down payment, and then leveraged that property again to lease the 2 sports cars sitting in their garage. He was juggling a dozen high-interest credit cards just to buy those fake designer watches and pay for the expensive dinners he used to impress Richard. But the ticking time bomb was exactly what he had mentioned at the restaurant. His primary mortgage had a balloon structure. In exchange for rock-bottom monthly payments over the last 3 years, the entire remaining principal of $500,000 was coming due all at once. DeAndre had banked everything on getting a massive bonus from Richard's upcoming public offering. He assumed Richard would bail him out in exchange for his loyalty and his dirty work during our divorce, but I had heard Richard dismiss him like a stray dog. DeAndre had no cash, no backup plan, and no wealthy benefactor to save him. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Ms. Carmichael. It was past midnight, but she answered on the second ring. "I found our weak link," I told her, my eyes scanning the glowing mortgage documents. "My brother-in-law is drowning in subprime debt. I want to buy it. All of it." Ms. Carmichael did not miss a beat. "Which proxy do you want to use?" "Use the distressed asset fund we registered in Delaware last week," I instructed. "Contact his primary lender first thing in the morning. Offer to buy DeAndre's entire loan portfolio at a 5% premium. Those subprime lenders love fast liquidity. They will sell his paper to us without a second thought." "Consider it done," she replied, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "And once we own the debt, we accelerate the timeline," I said coldly. "Call in the balloon payment immediately. Give him zero room to breathe." By noon the next day, the transaction was complete. Millions of dollars from my great-uncle's trust flowed quietly through the Delaware proxy, purchasing the paper on DeAndre's condo, his cars, and his personal loans. Legally, my shadow company was now DeAndre's sole creditor. I owned the roof over his head. I sat back in my cheap plastic chair and drafted the legal notice myself, ensuring every single word was compliant with state foreclosure laws. I demanded the immediate payment of $500,000, citing a standard clause that allowed the new debt holder to refuse any refinancing options. I authorized a premium courier service to deliver the documents directly to his real estate office. Through my screen, I tracked the courier's GPS route. I watched the digital dot move across the city grid, finally stopping at DeAndre's luxury brokerage firm. A minute later, the delivery confirmation pinged in my inbox. Signature acquired. I closed my eyes easily, picturing the exact look on his face. DeAndre, sitting at his glass desk wearing his counterfeit Rolex, opening a heavy legal envelope, expecting a new property listing. Instead, he would find an aggressive, non-negotiable 7-day foreclosure notice. 7 days to produce $500,000 in liquid cash, or he and Olivia would be thrown out onto the street, their cars repossessed, and his fake empire reduced to rubble. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee and stared at the delivery confirmation. I wondered how my sister Olivia would react when she found out her glamorous life was a lie. She had gladly poured her wine on my shoes to impress Richard, secure in the belief that her husband was a rising star. She was about to learn that she was married to a massive fraud. The first domino had officially been pushed. DeAndre was trapped in a financial vice, and the pressure was designed to crush him slowly. Now, all I had to do was wait for him to panic, because desperate men always make careless mistakes. I did not have to wait long for the panic to set in. Sitting in my dimly lit apartment, I used my encrypted servers to monitor DeAndre's financial heartbeat. The moment the foreclosure notice was delivered, his credit inquiries spiked aggressively. Through my screens, I watched him desperately apply for emergency personal loans, high-interest bridge loans, and hard money advances. He was frantic, trying anything to cover the $500,000. Every single application was automatically denied within minutes. His debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic, and his credit was officially radioactive. I knew his next move before he even made it. He had exhausted all his institutional options. He only had one lifeline left. He was going to Richard. I wanted a front-row seat to the destruction. I pulled my thin coat tight against the chill and took the subway down to the financial district. Montgomery PropTech occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, intimidating glass skyscraper. I did not go inside. Instead, I bought a black coffee from a street vendor and waited on the opposite sidewalk, blending perfectly into the lunchtime crowd of corporate workers. To hear what was about to happen, I relied on Richard's biggest weakness, his profound arrogance. When we first built the company, I personally configured the executive suite, smart hub, and security systems. Richard never bothered to change the master administrative passwords after he forced me out. He genuinely believed I was too technologically illiterate and too broken to ever pose a threat. I pulled out my phone, opened a secure terminal proxy, and tapped directly into his private office intercom microphone. The audio fed crystal clear into my wireless earbuds. Right on schedule. DeAndre's leased sports car screeched into the loading zone across the street. He practically fell out of the driver's seat. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened, the usual arrogant swagger completely erased from his posture. He sprinted through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, desperate and unhinged. A few minutes later, the audio in my earbuds flared to life. DeAndre burst into Richard's executive office, completely ignoring the protests of the executive assistant. "Richard, I need your help right now," DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking with raw hysteria. "Get out of my office, DeAndre. I am preparing for a board meeting," Richard replied, his tone dripping with extreme irritation and condescension. "They are taking my house, Richard. Some shadow fund just bought my paper and called the balloon payment, $500,000. I need an advance on the IPO bonus today. Just wire it to my account." "I will pay you back with interest," DeAndre begged, his words tumbling out in a pathetic rush. Richard let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed through the microphone. "Advance? What bonus? You are a freelance broker, DeAndre. You do not have equity in this company. You get a standard commission when you sell a commercial property. That is it." "Are you kidding me?" DeAndre yelled, the desperate begging suddenly morphing into venomous anger. "I hid your properties during the divorce. I routed those offshore transfers through my dummy LLCs so Sophia would not find them. I tipped off the repo guys yesterday just to make you smile. I did all your dirty work. You owe me." Silence hung heavy over the line for a few agonizing seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice was dangerously low, completely devoid of empathy. "I owe you absolutely nothing. You were compensated for your minor clerical services. You are a low-rent hustler who bought a fake Rolex and thought he could play in the major leagues. Do not ever walk into my office and threaten me again." DeAndre sputtered, trying desperately to backpedal. "Richard, please, if I lose the condo, Olivia will leave me. I have nothing." "Security," Richard called out smoothly, pressing the intercom button. "We have a hostile trespasser in the executive suite. Remove him by force if necessary." Through the audio feed, I heard the immediate scuffle. DeAndre shouting obscenities, the heavy footsteps of the guards, the violent sound of a physical struggle. I took the earbuds out and watched the glass lobby doors across the street. 2 massive security guards dragged DeAndre out by his arms. They shoved him roughly onto the concrete sidewalk. He stumbled and fell hard, scraping his hands and tearing the knee of his expensive tailored suit. The fake Rolex hit the pavement with a sickening crunch. The guards turned their backs and walked back inside, leaving him thoroughly humiliated in front of dozens of passing Wall Street executives. DeAndre slowly got to his knees. He looked completely shattered. The illusion of his grand success was dead on the pavement. Richard had just discarded him like a piece of worthless trash. My trap had snapped shut flawlessly. DeAndre was no longer a loyal lapdog. He was a wounded, furious animal backed into a corner, and a desperate animal will turn on its master to survive. It was time for my shadow fund to offer him a very specific, poisoned lifeline. I watched from across the street as DeAndre finally picked himself up off the concrete. He brushed the dirt from his ruined suit, his face contorted into an ugly mask of rage and humiliation. He limped toward his leased sports car, looking back at the towering glass skyscraper with pure hatred. It was the perfect moment to strike. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed Miss Carmichael. "He is ready," I said, my eyes tracking DeAndre as he slammed his car door. "Have your associate make the call right now. Hit him while the sting of Richard's betrayal is still fresh. Offer him the absolute forgiveness of every single dime he owes us." "And the price?" Miss Carmichael asked smoothly over the encrypted line. "Everything," I replied. "I want the internal transaction ledgers. I want the routing numbers for the offshore accounts he set up for Richard. Tell him we want the digital keys to Montgomery PropTech's hidden financial kingdom." 15 minutes later, as I rode the subway back to my apartment, the audio feed from DeAndre's phone, intercepted by my proxy servers, crackled to life. He was sitting in his car, likely screaming at his steering wheel, when the unknown number flashed on his screen. "Who is this?" DeAndre snapped, his voice rough. "Good afternoon," a crisp, professional male voice replied. "It is Ms. Carmichael's lead investigator, acting as the representative for the Delaware Fund. I represent the firm that recently acquired your debt portfolio. We are aware of your current liquidity crisis regarding the $500,000 balloon payment." "I need more time," DeAndre pleaded, his anger instantly vanishing, replaced by sheer panic. "I can get the money, I just need an extension." "We are not interested in an extension, DeAndre," the investigator said coldly. "We are, however, interested in a trade. My clients are conducting a hostile financial probe into Richard Montgomery and his upcoming public offering. We know you facilitated his offshore transfers during his recent divorce. We want the digital ledger, the raw data." DeAndre went completely silent. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his desperate mind. The investigator continued driving the nail home. "We will instantly forgive your entire debt portfolio, the condo, the cars, the personal loans, all wiped clean. You walk away free, and your wife never has to know you were a day away from total bankruptcy." "Why?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "That is not your concern. Do we have a deal? Or do I initiate the foreclosure proceedings with the county clerk right now?" "Wait," DeAndre said hastily. "Wait. He just threw me out like garbage. He practically begged me to hide his assets from his wife, and then he left me to drown." A bitter, vindictive laugh escaped his lips. "You want the ledgers? Fine. I have everything backed up on an encrypted flash drive. Where do we meet?" They arranged a drop at a crowded coffee shop in Midtown, exactly 1 hour later. I monitored the entire exchange through the secure audio link. DeAndre was paranoid, demanding verbal confirmation of the debt forgiveness before sliding a plain silver flash drive across the table. The investigator handed him a legally binding release of lien document, officially clearing his $500,000 debt. DeAndre took the paper and practically ran out of the cafe, believing he had just pulled off the greatest escape of his life. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the rope to the exact woman he helped hang. By the time the sun began to set over the industrial district, a sharp knock echoed against my apartment door. I opened it to find the investigator standing in the dimly lit hallway. He did not say a word. He simply handed me a small manila envelope, nodded respectfully, and walked away. I locked the deadbolt and carried the envelope to my glowing server rack. I ripped the paper open and let the silver flash drive fall into my palm. It felt heavier than it looked. This tiny piece of metal contained the sins of 2 greedy men. Richard thought he could steal the company I built and leave me freezing in a car. DeAndre thought he could profit off my misery and mock my worn-out shoes. I sat down in my cheap plastic chair and plugged the drive into my secure terminal. The screen flashed blue, prompting a decryption sequence. I cracked my knuckles and typed in the bypass commands. The progress bar raced across the monitor. A cold smile touched my lips. The shadow war was stepping into the light. I leaned closer to the monitor as the final protocol completed. Folders of restricted data spilled across my screen. Every hidden wire transfer and dummy corporation was laid bare. I was no longer hunting in the dark. The screen illuminated my face with the harsh, cold light of pure, unadulterated fraud. Thousands of PDF files, bank statements, and encrypted email logs populated the directory. DeAndre was a fool, but he was a meticulous fool. He had kept receipts for every single illegal errand Richard had ever sent him on, likely as an insurance policy. Unfortunately for him, that policy had just been cashed out by the enemy. I did not care about Richard's petty tax evasion or his padded expense accounts. I was looking for the killing blow. I opened my custom sorting algorithm and fed it the raw data, instructing it to flag any asset transfers exceeding $1 million that occurred within the 90 days prior to Richard serving me with divorce papers. The server hummed softly. Within seconds, a single folder appeared on the center screen. It was labeled Project Apex. I clicked it open. My breath hitched in my chest. Staring back at me were the original patent filings and the complete, unredacted source code registry for the Montgomery PropTech predictive valuation software. This was the algorithm I had spent 3 relentless years writing in our freezing garage, pouring my blood, sweat, and brilliant financial modeling into every single line of code. It was the absolute heart and soul of the company, the sole reason venture capitalists were throwing money at him. And right below, it was a bill of sale. Exactly 6 weeks before our divorce, Richard had executed a quiet internal corporate restructuring. He sold the exclusive perpetual rights of the entire intellectual property to an offshore entity named Apex Global Holdings, registered to a post office box in Georgetown, Cayman Islands. The sale price was listed as one single insulting dollar, a literal insult to my life's work. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Richard had legally severed the brain from the body of his own company. By moving the intellectual property to a shell corporation he controlled entirely in secret, he instantly rendered Montgomery PropTech financially worthless on paper. When my divorce lawyers demanded an audit, Richard simply showed them a company that owned no assets and was paying massive licensing fees to an anonymous offshore vendor just to keep the lights on. It was a perfectly executed illusion. He had legally robbed me of my half of $1 billion tech empire, and he had used DeAndre to file the offshore registration papers to keep his own fingerprints off the transaction. But as I dug deeper into the Apex Global Holdings corporate registry, the financial auditor in me noticed a glaring discrepancy. Richard was a visionary salesman, but he was a notoriously sloppy administrator. He had set up the shell company, transferred the assets, and then completely ignored the ongoing offshore compliance requirements. I pulled up the Cayman Islands corporate registry database through one of my proxy servers. I cross-referenced the registration number DeAndre had saved in the file. The status of Apex Global Holdings flashed in bright red letters across my screen. Delinquent. Richard had been so focused on preparing his main company for its massive public offering that he forgot to pay the annual registered agent fees and corporate franchise taxes for his secret Cayman shell. It was a few thousand, absolute pocket change for a man like him. But in the world of offshore finance, failing to maintain your corporate standing is a fatal error. The Cayman government had placed the holding company into a state of suspended animation. It was vulnerable. It was bleeding. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the red delinquent status. Richard was parading around New York City, throwing lavish dinners and bragging to the financial press about his upcoming IPO. He was about to ring the bell on Wall Street and sell shares of a tech company to the public, but he did not actually own the technology. The code belonged to a delinquent offshore ghost. And because he had hidden it so well to screw me over in the divorce, his own corporate lawyers handling the IPO had no idea. They thought the software was safe in-house. The irony was practically poetic. The exact weapon Richard used to destroy my life was now sitting completely unguarded in the Caribbean, waiting for someone to claim it. He thought he had outsmarted the entire legal system. He thought I was just a broken woman crying in a repossessed car. He had no idea that I was sitting in a crumbling apartment holding the master key to his entire fraudulent kingdom. I picked up my secure phone. It was time to wake up Ms. Carmichael. We were about to go shopping in the Cayman Islands, and I was going to buy back my own stolen empire using the very fortune he knew absolutely nothing about. The following evening was my mother, Beatrice's, 60th birthday. To the outside world, I was still the broken, penniless ex-wife, oblivious to the massive leverage I now held. I had to maintain that illusion flawlessly. If Richard or my family suspected I had any financial power, my entire legal strategy would collapse. I went to a local discount store and purchased a simple, inexpensive silver picture frame. I placed a photograph of my mother and me from my college graduation inside, wrapped it in plain paper, and took the bus to the Oakmont Country Club. The venue was dripping in old money and forced elegance. Valets rushed to park luxury European sedans while I walked up the long, sweeping driveway in my scuffed boots. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over dozens of affluent guests sipping champagne. I spotted my family holding court near an extravagant ice sculpture. Beatrice wore a stunning emerald silk gown, laughing loudly with her wealthy friends. Winston stood by her side, holding a highball glass, while Olivia hovered nearby, looking desperate for attention. DeAndre was noticeably absent, likely still hiding in shame after yesterday's absolute financial destruction. I took a deep breath, clutching the small wrapped box, and walked directly toward them. The moment Olivia saw me, her fake smile vanished. "Mom, look who decided to crash," Olivia loudly announced, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. Beatrice turned, her expression instantly hardening from joyful celebration to sheer disgust. "Sophia, what on earth are you doing here?" Beatrice hissed, stepping away from her friends as if poverty were contagious. "You were explicitly not invited." I held out the small package. "It's your 60th birthday, Mom. I just wanted to bring you a gift." I spoke softly, perfectly playing the role of the desperate outcast daughter. Beatrice snatched the box from my hands and ripped the cheap paper apart. She stared at the silver frame and the old photograph. A cruel, mocking laugh erupted from her throat. "A discount store picture frame," she sneered, holding it up for her friends to see. "Is this supposed to make up for the absolute embarrassment you have caused this family? Richard is funding my entire retirement, and you bring me a piece of tin." With a flick of her wrist, Beatrice tossed the frame directly into a nearby trash receptacle. The glass shattered against the bottom. "You should leave before you ruin the evening entirely," she commanded. I stood my ground, keeping my head bowed, absorbing the public humiliation. Because right on cue, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. Richard made his grand entrance, his arm draped casually around Brittany. He wore a custom tuxedo, radiating the obnoxious confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. The moment my family saw him, they completely abandoned me. Beatrice rushed forward, her arms wide open, greeting the man who had stolen her daughter's company with genuine affection. "Richard, darling, you made it," Beatrice cooed. Richard handed her a small velvet box from a high-end jeweler. "Only the best for my favorite former mother-in-law," he charmed, flashing his brilliant, predatory smile. Winston shook his hand vigorously, and Olivia practically tripped over herself to compliment Brittany's designer dress. I stood a few feet away, completely invisible to the people who shared my blood. Richard motioned for a waiter, grabbed a glass of champagne, and tapped his fork against the rim. The immediate circle of guests, including my parents and sister, quieted down to listen. "I have a very special announcement to make tonight," Richard declared, his voice booming with authority. "The Securities and Exchange Commission has officially cleared Montgomery PropTech. We are going public next month." Gasps of excitement rippled through the group. But Richard was not finished. He turned directly to my father. "Winston, you and Beatrice have always supported me, even when certain other people dragged me down." He shot a brief, venomous glance in my direction. "Because of your loyalty, I am opening up my friends and family allocation to you. I am offering you the chance to buy pre-IPO shares at rock-bottom internal pricing. The moment the bell rings next month, those shares will instantly triple in value. I am going to make you all millionaires." Winston's eyes went wide with pure, unfiltered greed. Beatrice clutched her diamond necklace, gasping in delight. Olivia practically screamed. They were instantly blinded by the promise of effortless wealth. I watched them eagerly agree to hand over their life savings to a man selling shares in a hollow shell. They had absolutely no idea that I legally owned the core technology he was promising to take public. The trap was set, and my family just sprinted right into it. Over the next 72 hours, I watched my family systematically destroy their own financial futures. From the glowing screens of my apartment command center, I tracked the frantic movement of their assets with clinical precision. Winston and Beatrice did not just dip into savings for Richard's pre-public offering shares. They went completely all in, blinded by the promise of luxury. I watched the digital ledgers in real time as my father liquidated his entire retirement portfolio, incurring massive early withdrawal penalties without a second thought. But that was not enough for their greed. The very next morning, public county records showed a new, massive lien filed against their pristine colonial home. They had taken out a high-interest second mortgage, leveraging the very roof over their heads to hand $500,000 directly to the man who ruined me. Olivia was even more reckless. DeAndre was currently fighting for his absolute survival against my proxy shadow fund, desperately trying to hide his impending foreclosure from her to maintain his fake alpha male persona. Ignorant to her husband's silent collapse, Olivia went behind his back, forged DeAndre's signature on a joint investment account, and drained their remaining liquid cash reserves down to the last penny. She wanted to be a tech millionaire. She wanted to sit in the VIP sections with Brittany and Richard, laughing at the peasants below. My family was voluntarily chaining themselves to the hull of a sinking ship, completely mesmerized by the captain's empty golden promises. As an auditor, I had spent my career watching desperate people make terrible financial decisions, but watching my own blood walk blindly into an absolute slaughter felt profoundly different. I did not love them anymore. The freezing rain on their porch had washed away whatever lingering affection I held. But a tiny, stubborn piece of my professional conscience demanded that I give them one single, final warning. If they ignored it, their ruin would be entirely on their own hands, and my conscience would be permanently clear. I left my apartment, took the train back to the wealthy suburbs, and walked up that long driveway one last time. I found my parents and Olivia in the sunroom of the colonial house, drinking iced tea and reviewing the glossy, fraudulent prospectus Richard had given them. Winston was eagerly calculating their projected wealth on a yellow legal pad. I walked unannounced through the patio door. They looked up, their smiles instantly turning into aggressive scowls. "I am not here to ask for money," I said quickly, holding up my hands. "I am here to stop you from losing yours. Do not buy those shares." Winston scoffed loudly, tossing his expensive pen onto the glass table. "Are you still bitter, Sophia?" Cannot stand to see us succeed? Listen to me, I pleaded, taking a cautious step forward. I built the financial models for that company from the ground up. I know exactly how Richard operates. The business is a complete house of cards. The technology valuation he is selling you is entirely fabricated. If you give him your retirement funds and the equity in this house, you will lose absolutely everything. He is using you to pad his books. Beatrice stood up violently, her chair scraping harshly against the stone floor, her face flushed with sudden vicious anger. She marched across the sunroom and raised her hand high. The slap echoed sharply against the glass walls, a brutal cracking sound. My cheek burned with a fierce, stinging heat. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, but I planted my feet and did not fall. I slowly turned my face back to look straight into her furious eyes. "You are a pathetic, jealous, vindictive woman," Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with venom and absolute contempt. "You could not hold on to a successful, brilliant man, and now you want to sabotage your own family because we are finally getting the wealth and status we deserve. Richard warned us you would try to poison this deal. Get out of my house and never come back." I stood perfectly still, the red mark blooming hot across my face. I looked at Winston, who was pointedly ignoring me to stare at his legal pad, and Olivia, who was actively smirking behind her glass of iced tea. The absolute last thread of familial guilt evaporated from my body, leaving nothing but cold, crystal-clear resolve. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. "I will never bother you again. Enjoy your investment." I turned my back on them and walked out through the patio door, stepping off the manicured lawn for the very last time. I had done my part. The trap was now fully locked, and they had eagerly thrown away the key. Let them burn. The train ride back to the city was a blur of gray skies and rattling steel. My cheek still throbbed slightly from where Beatrice had struck me, but the emotional sting was entirely gone. I had offered them a life raft, and they chose to set it on fire. Returning to my drafty apartment, I locked the deadbolt, brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, and sat down at my glowing monitors. The time for family drama was over. It was time for a corporate execution. I picked up my secure phone and initiated an encrypted video call with Ms. Carmichael. She appeared on my center screen, sitting in her pristine New York office, looking sharp and entirely ready for war. "My family is fully invested in his public offering," I told her, my voice strictly business. "The emotional ties are severed. I want to initiate the Cayman strike immediately. Walk me through the exact legal mechanics of his vulnerability." Ms. Carmichael nodded, typing rapidly on her end. "I brought in our offshore corporate specialist to review the files you pulled from DeAndre's flash drive. Richard's arrogance has handed us a masterpiece of legal negligence. Apex Global Holdings is not just delinquent on its annual fees. To maintain absolute secrecy during your divorce proceedings, Richard terminated his local registered agent in Georgetown. He set up a blind post office box to receive government correspondence." I leaned forward, the auditor inside me piecing the puzzle together. "So, the Cayman Registry has been sending delinquency notices to an empty metal box for months." "I'm sorry," Ms. Carmichael replied, a predatory smile spreading across her face. "But it appears his arrogance has provided you with an even greater victory than you initially planned. Under the Cayman Islands Companies Act, when a corporate entity fails to pay its government franchise taxes and maintain a registered agent for a specific duration, it falls into critical bad standing. It loses its corporate veil and its right to conduct business or protect its assets. But the most crucial detail is how the local law handles outstanding corporate debt for entities in this state." I pulled up the legal statutes on my second monitor, scanning the dense legal jargon. "A third-party creditor can petition the Grand Court for a winding-up order," I read aloud. "Exactly," Ms. Carmichael confirmed, "but we do not want to liquidate the company. We want to own it. Because Richard fired his agent, he left unpaid invoices with local Cayman service providers, not just the government taxes, but local legal fees and hosting costs. We're talking about less than $30,000 in total debt. But because the company is officially in bad standing, those local creditors have the right to seize the company assets to satisfy the unpaid balances. And Richard valued the intellectual property at exactly $1 when he transferred it. I said, the absolute brilliance of his fatal mistake washing over me. He did that to ensure I got nothing in the divorce settlement. He documented the core algorithm of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire as being worth a single piece of pocket change. Ms. Carmichael adjusted her glasses, her eyes gleaming. Precisely. The legal valuation of the asset held by Apex Global Holdings is 1. The company owes $30,000 in debt. It is massively insolvent on paper. Our Delaware proxy fund is going to reach out to those Cayman creditors tomorrow morning. We will purchase all of the outstanding debt of Apex Global Holdings at a premium. Once we own the debt, I continued, tracing the strategy to its lethal conclusion, we become the sole senior creditor of a delinquent, undefended offshore corporation. And since the company has no registered agent to answer our demand for payment, we can legally seize the collateral to satisfy the debt. The collateral being the intellectual property, she finished. We execute a hostile debt-for-equity swap. It is completely legal, entirely binding. And because Richard is actively ignoring the Cayman entity to focus on his Wall Street public offering, he will not receive a single notification that his company has been hijacked until it is far too late. It was a flawless, devastating maneuver. Richard had built a massive fortress of lies to protect his wealth from me, but he left the back door completely wide open. He was so obsessed with playing the visionary tech founder that he neglected the basic, boring administrative duties that keep a corporation alive. Prepare the acquisition documents, I instructed, my fingers flying across my keyboard to route the necessary capital from my great-uncle's trust fund. I want our proxy to buy that debt by the end of the business day tomorrow. Do not leave a single paper trail pointing back to New York. Bury the transaction under 3 layers of non-disclosure agreements. I will have our offshore team file the paperwork with the Grand Court the moment the debt is acquired, Miss Carmichael assured me. I ended the call and leaned back in my cheap plastic chair. The clanking radiator in the corner of my slum apartment provided a steady, rhythmic soundtrack to my impending victory. I had spent years analyzing spreadsheets, looking for missing pennies in corporate ledgers. Now I was using those exact skills to orchestrate the greatest financial heist of my life. I was about to legally steal back my own company, and Richard was going to pay for the privilege of handing it to me. The sun had barely risen over the industrial skyline when the execution phase began. I sat in front of my monitors, a cold cup of coffee resting on the plastic table. The encrypted terminal glowed with the routing interface of my great-uncle's trust. With a few precise keystrokes, I authorized the transfer. A microscopic fraction of my $68 million fortune slipped out of the secure New York account, washing through our Delaware proxy fund before silently crossing international waters. It was a surgical strike, $35,000 to be exact. Enough to cover the delinquent franchise taxes, the abandoned registered agent fees, and the outstanding legal penalties that Richard had arrogantly ignored. Watching the digital progress bar inch across the screen, I felt no anxiety. As a former financial auditor, this was my battlefield. Numbers were my weapons, and they obeyed my commands without question. The trap was springing shut exactly as I had designed it. Every sleepless night spent shivering in my car, every mocking insult from my sister, and every moment of betrayal from my parents had led to this exact mathematical culmination. I was completely taking back my life, one offshore document at a time. By 9 in the morning, Ms. Carmichael was on an encrypted audio link, bridging a direct connection to our corporate specialist on the ground in Georgetown. I listened as the specialist walked into the Cayman Islands Government Registry office. Through the earpiece, I could hear the rustle of heavy legal paper and the dull thud of a rubber stamp. "We are filing the satisfaction of debt notice now," the specialist reported, his voice calm and methodical. "The local creditors have accepted the premium buyout without asking a single question. The proxy fund is officially the sole senior debt holder of Apex Global Holdings. Now we submit the hostile equity swap petition to the Grand Court. Because the shell company had no legal representation to contest the filing, the process moved with terrifying speed. Under their corporate statutes, an undefended insolvent entity facing a senior creditor demand is automatically subject to asset seizure. It is a ruthless but entirely legal corporate mechanism. The waiting was the only difficult part. I paced the length of my tiny, drafty apartment, listening to the radiator hiss. Every 10 minutes, I refreshed the offshore corporate database. I imagined Richard sitting in his pristine glass office, drinking imported water, reviewing his slide decks, utterly blind to the invisible noose tightening around his corporate neck. He was so busy selling the future that he forgot to secure the foundation. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my secure phone buzzed. It was Ms. Carmichael. The line was completely silent for a second before she spoke. "It's done, Sophia. The Grand Court approved the debt for equity transfer. The ownership registry has been officially rewritten." I rushed back to the monitors and pulled up the updated filings. The screen refreshed. The name of Richard's anonymous holding company was gone. In its place, listed as the 100% legal owner of the corporate entity and all its intellectual property, was my Delaware proxy fund, so-called tech visionary, now legally belonged to me. The paper trail was absolutely flawless and completely undeniable. The sheer magnitude of the victory settled over me like a heavy, comforting blanket. Richard had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on aggressive divorce lawyers to ensure I walked away with absolutely nothing. He had humiliated me, forced me into a repossessed car, and convinced my own family to turn against me. Yet, here I was, sitting in a slum, legally seizing a billion-dollar technology asset for the price of a mid-sized sedan. I opened a new tab on my browser and checked the financial news feeds. Richard's smiling face was plastered across the front page of a major Wall Street publication. The headline praised his upcoming public offering, calling him a pioneer in real estate technology. He was actively selling shares to the public and to my greedy parents based on a product he no longer had the legal right to use. He was driving a luxury sports car at 200 miles per hour, completely unaware that I had just quietly dismantled the brakes. The trap was fully loaded. Tomorrow night was his lavish pre-public offering gala, the pinnacle of his fabricated success, and I was going to be there, serving the champagne, watching the dead man walk. The grand ballroom was transformed into a monument to Richard's towering ego. Massive banners draped from the ceiling bearing the Montgomery PropTech logo. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of Wall Street elites and eager investors. I stood near the ice sculpture in my stiff white catering uniform, holding a tray loaded with vintage champagne. To everyone in this room, I was just a nameless servant. None of them knew that the woman pouring their drinks was the legal owner of the very technology they were celebrating. My family positioned themselves at the front of the VIP section, acting like royalty. Olivia wore a sequined designer gown that she had undoubtedly purchased on credit. She clung to DeAndre, who was back to his arrogant, swaggering self. Thanks to my shadow proxy, his subprime debt had been entirely wiped clean in exchange for the flash drive. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the financial system. He strutted around in a fresh tuxedo, unaware that his wife had secretly drained their remaining savings to buy Richard's worthless pre-public offering shares. They were a perfectly matched pair of fools, entirely bankrupt, but aggressively pretending to be rich. I kept my head down, navigating the crowd with practiced ease. Eventually, my route took me directly past their table. Olivia spotted me instantly. She nudged DeAndre and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Well, look who it is," Olivia sneered. "I told Richard not to let the catering company keep you. You're really bringing down the aesthetic of our VIP section." "Sophia." DeAndre grabbed a flute of champagne from my tray without looking at me. "Make sure you keep these coming, waitress," he ordered dismissively. "We're celebrating massive financial gains tonight. Try not to drop anything." I offered a blank, polite smile. "Enjoy your evening," I replied, turning away with the silver tray perfectly balanced in my hand. Their insults felt like absolutely nothing. They were ghosts haunting a graveyard they did not even know they were buried in. The string quartet stopped playing. The heavy hum of conversation died down as a sharp spotlight hit the main stage. Richard walked out to a massive round of applause. He looked flawless, wearing a tailored midnight blue tuxedo, waving to the crowd with the practiced grace of a seasoned politician. Brittany stood in the front row, clapping enthusiastically, her diamond ring catching the stage lights. Richard stepped up to the crystal podium and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, everyone," he began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Tonight is not just a celebration of Montgomery PropTech going public tomorrow morning. Tonight is a celebration of pure, unyielding vision." I stood near the edge of the stage, watching him spin his web of lies. "When I first conceived the predictive valuation algorithm," Richard continued, placing a hand theatrically over his heart, "people told me it was impossible. But I spent 3 years working out of a freezing, cramped garage. I spent countless sleepless nights writing the source code line by line, sacrificing everything to bring this technology to life. I built the architecture of this platform with my own 2 hands." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his lie almost made me laugh out loud. Richard did not write a single line of that code. He did not even know how to reboot the secure servers. I was the one who froze in that garage. I was the one who engineered the financial models and wrote the algorithms while he was out schmoozing investors and having affairs. He was publicly stealing my life's work, basking in the applause of hundreds of wealthy strangers. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Winston and Beatrice were clapping so hard they looked manic, tears of greedy joy streaming down her face. Richard raised his glass of champagne to the room. "To the future," he toasted. As he stepped down from the stage, surrounded by a swarm of congratulatory investors, I walked directly into his path. I held out my silver tray. Richard paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second when he recognized me in the catering uniform. "Champagne, sir," I offered, my voice steady and professional. He quickly recovered, a cruel smirk touching his lips. He took a glass from my tray and leaned in close. "I hope you took notes on that speech, Sophia," he whispered maliciously. "That is what real success looks like." I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression entirely calm. "Oh, I took very detailed notes, Richard. Congratulations on your big day tomorrow." I walked away, leaving him to his hollow victory. He had the applause, but I had the legal deeds. Tomorrow morning, his entire fabricated, stolen empire would finally shatter into a million pieces on live national television. While the champagne continued to flow and the string quartet resumed playing in the grand ballroom, a very different kind of operation was unfolding miles away. Sitting in her pristine downtown office, Ms. Carmichael was executing the final lethal phase of our legal strike. She hit the send button on her secure terminal, officially transmitting a formal cease and desist and license revocation notice directly to the prestigious corporate law firm handling Richard's public offering. The document was a masterpiece of absolute legal devastation. It explicitly stated that Apex Global Holdings, now under new ownership, was immediately and permanently revoking any and all usage rights to the predictive valuation source code previously granted to Montgomery PropTech. It demanded an immediate halt to the public offering, citing massive securities fraud if the company attempted to sell shares based on technology it no longer legally possessed. Across town, on the 50th floor of a towering glass high-rise, the offices of Harrington and Cole were buzzing with frantic late-night energy. It was almost midnight, and the legal team was running on cold espresso and pure adrenaline, assembling the final regulatory binders for the morning bell-ringing ceremony. Leading the charge was Preston, a pompous senior partner who was already mentally spending his massive seven-figure success fee. An urgent notification pinged on Preston's primary monitor, accompanied by a heavy certified courier envelope dropped onto his mahogany desk by an exhausted paralegal. Preston sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as he sliced open the envelope. He pulled out the crisp legal document and scanned the header. Apex Global Holdings, Cayman Islands. Preston rolled his eyes, a smug, dismissive sound escaping his throat. He remembered Richard briefly mentioning a Cayman shell company months ago during a casual lunch. Richard had bragged about using a dummy corporation to artificially devalue his assets during a messy divorce with his ex-wife. Richard had assured Preston that the offshore entity was completely dormant, just an empty box holding paperwork to fool an auditor. Because he was completely blinded by his own arrogance and the impending payday, Preston did not bother to log into the international registry to verify the current ownership status of that shell company. He took one look at the bold cease and desist lettering and immediately categorized it as a pathetic extortion attempt. In the world of high-stakes corporate law, patent trolls and bottom-feeding scammers frequently send threatening letters on the eve of a major public offering, hoping the company will quietly pay a quick settlement just to make the nuisance go away. "This is absolute garbage," Preston muttered to himself, tossing the heavy certified document into a plastic tray labeled Secondary Review. Some island-registered agent is trying to squeeze us for back taxes, or it's a desperate patent troll fishing for a payout. A junior associate poked his head into the office looking anxious. "Sir, that notice demands an immediate halt to the public offering. Should we call Mr. Montgomery at the gala to inform him?" Preston glared at the young lawyer as if he had just suggested something incredibly stupid. "Absolutely not. Richard is currently entertaining our anchor investors. His explicit orders were to handle all minor administrative friction internally. He told me not to interrupt his victory lap unless the building was literally burning to the ground. If I call him tonight over a spam letter from a dormant dummy corporation, he will fire us both before sunrise." "But sir, the license revocation clause?" the associate began, hesitating. "I said leave it," Preston snapped, his tone final and authoritative. "We own that shell company. You cannot sue yourself. It's a clerical glitch. I will have an intern draft a response on Monday morning after the checks clear. Now get back to assembling the press packets." With a few quick keystrokes, Preston deleted the urgent email from his inbox and permanently buried the physical warning under a stack of catering receipts. He leaned back in his leather chair, completely satisfied with his own brilliant decision-making. He had absolutely no idea that he had just ignored a live grenade sitting directly on his desk. Back at the gala, I finished my catering shift in total silence. I gathered my belongings from the staff locker room, my cheap rubber-soled shoes echoing against the concrete floor. As I walked out of the service exit and into the crisp, cool midnight air, my secure phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a single encrypted text message from Ms. Carmichael, delivered and ignored. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked up at the towering skyscrapers glowing against the dark night sky. Richard's highly paid, arrogant legal team had functioned exactly as I anticipated. Their pride had completely blinded them to the impending catastrophe. The fuse was officially lit, and the bomb squad had just decided to take a nap. Tomorrow morning, Wall Street was going to witness a massacre. The gala finally ended in the early hours of the morning. While I was safely back in my apartment, reviewing the final regulatory documents, the rats in Richard's inner circle were beginning to turn on each other. DeAndre had spent the entire evening drinking expensive champagne, his ego wildly inflated by the sudden, miraculous disappearance of his $500,000 debt. He genuinely believed he was a master negotiator who had successfully outsmarted a shadow fund. But his greed was a bottomless pit. Freed from his financial chains, he no longer just wanted to survive, he wanted to be incredibly rich, and he thought he held the perfect winning lottery ticket in his pocket. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, Richard arrived at the private underground parking garage of his luxury penthouse building. He stepped out of his chauffeured vehicle, straightening his tuxedo jacket, looking completely exhausted but triumphant. As the driver pulled away, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was DeAndre. Richard's triumphant expression instantly twisted into a mask of pure irritation. "I thought I told security to ban you from my properties," Richard snapped, his voice echoing in the empty concrete structure. "You're lucky I let you and Olivia stay in the VIP section tonight. Go home, DeAndre." "I am not going anywhere until we renegotiate my compensation," DeAndre demanded. His voice slurred slightly from the alcohol, but thick with arrogant confidence. "You're ringing the bell on Wall Street in exactly 7 hours. You're about to be worth billions. I want $10 million wired into my account by noon tomorrow." Richard stared at him for a long moment, completely bewildered by the sheer audacity. "You want $10 million? Are you out of your mind? You're a low-level broker. You do not dictate terms to me." "I do, and I hold the keys to your entire kingdom," DeAndre countered, taking a step closer. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a duplicate silver flash drive, waving it in the dim garage lighting. "You thought you could just throw me away after I hid your assets from Sophia. But I made copies, Richard. I have every single transaction ledger. I have the routing numbers for the Cayman Islands Shell Company. If I do not get my $10 million, this drive goes straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission and every major financial news outlet before the market opens. Your public offering will be dead on arrival." DeAndre stood tall, breathing heavily, fully expecting Richard to panic. He expected Richard to beg, to negotiate, to immediately offer him a massive payout to keep his mouth shut. Instead, Richard began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a booming, cruel laugh that bounced off the concrete walls. He laughed so hard he had to lean against the hood of a parked sports car. DeAndre lowered the flash drive, his arrogant smirk faltering as confusion set in. "You really think you're a criminal mastermind, do you not?" Richard finally said, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. "You actually think I would let a desperate, incompetent fool like you handle my sensitive offshore transfers without a fail-safe?" Richard reached into his own tuxedo pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and held it up for DeAndre to see. Pressing play, a high-definition video illuminated the dark garage. DeAndre stared at the screen, his blood running completely cold. It was crystal-clear surveillance footage from inside his own real estate office. The video showed DeAndre hunched over his desk, actively forging signatures on federal bank transfer forms. The audio was flawless, recording DeAndre explicitly instructing a subordinate to illegally wire funds across state lines to avoid tax detection. "I own the building your brokerage leases," Richard explained, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet whisper. "I installed hidden cameras in your office the day you signed the lease. I have over 40 hours of high-definition video and audio of you committing textbook wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement." DeAndre began to tremble, the silver flash drive suddenly feeling like a block of lead in his hand. "If you ever breathe a single word about my offshore accounts," Richard continued, stepping directly into DeAndre's personal space, "or if you ever try to threaten me again, I will send this footage directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Wire fraud carries a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. You will lose your license. You will lose Olivia. And you will spend the best years of your life in a concrete cell. DeAndre tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak. "Now get out of my sight," Richard commanded, turning his back on the broken man. "And do not ever contact me again." Richard walked to his private elevator, the door sliding shut behind him, leaving DeAndre completely alone in the freezing garage. DeAndre fell to his knees on the hard concrete. He dropped the duplicate flash drive. He was completely trapped. He had tried to play God in a game where he was nothing more than a disposable pawn. From my apartment, monitoring the audio feed through my secure proxy server, I listened to DeAndre quietly sobbing in the dark. My trap was perfectly intact. Richard was still arrogantly marching toward his own destruction, and he had just neutralized the only person who could have accidentally warned him. The board was set for the final move. The sun rose on the final day of Richard's fabricated empire. Exactly 24 hours remained before the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. I stepped out of my crumbling apartment building into the crisp, biting morning air, wrapping my thin wool coat tightly around my shoulders. I was heading toward the subway for a mandatory in-person meeting with Ms. Carmichael downtown to finalize the federal paperwork. Every piece of the puzzle was perfectly locked into place. As I walked down the grimy, trash-lined sidewalk of the industrial district, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine cut through the typical rumble of delivery trucks. A sleek, midnight black Aston Martin suddenly swerved out of traffic and slowed to a crawl, pulling into the bus lane right next to me. The tinted passenger window slid down with a quiet, mechanical hum. Sitting behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel was Richard. He looked like a man who had already conquered the entire universe. He was wearing a brand new bespoke suit that probably cost more than the annual rent for my entire building. A pair of expensive designer sunglasses rested on the bridge of his nose. He leaned across the passenger seat, looking me up and down. A look of utter disgust perfectly mixed with victorious glee was plastered across his face. "Taking a morning stroll through your natural habitat, Sophia?" Richard mocked, his voice effortlessly carrying over the street noise. "I have a meeting with a warehouse developer a few blocks over, but seeing you trudging toward the subway really is the perfect start to my day." I stopped walking. I did not cross my arms or shrink away from his gaze. I simply stood on the curb and looked at him, feeling absolutely no intimidation. "You are looking very pleased with yourself today, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice even and entirely devoid of emotion. "Why should I not be?" he scoffed, revving the engine slightly just to hear it roar. "Tomorrow morning, I step onto the balcony of the stock exchange and ring the bell. Tomorrow morning, the company I built becomes a publicly traded powerhouse. I am going to be a billionaire before lunch. And what exactly are you doing tomorrow, Sophia? Still washing dishes and sweeping up broken glass for minimum wage?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that used to make me feel so incredibly small. But today, it just sounded like the bleating of a sheep walking willingly into a slaughterhouse. "You always had to drag me down to make yourself feel tall," Richard continued, pointing an arrogant finger at me. "You spent years telling me we were partners. You actually believed you were the brains behind the software. But look at us now. Look at where the chips fell. I have the empire, I have the wealth, and I have the absolute respect of Wall Street. You have a cheap coat and a subway pass. You are a total, undeniable failure. You built absolutely nothing." He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry right there on the dirty pavement. He desperately needed to see me broken one last time to validate his own massive ego before his big day. But the financial auditor inside me only saw a man aggressively bragging about a bank account that was already empty. I looked at the sleek lines of his expensive sports car, then up at his smug, arrogant face. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense or anger. Instead, I calmly reached down and buttoned the top button of my worn-out coat. I took a deep breath of the freezing city air, feeling more alive and powerful than I had in my entire life. Then I smiled. It was not a forced, polite smile. It was a genuine, radiant, terrifyingly calm smile. "You are right about one thing, Richard," I said, my voice completely steady. "Tomorrow is going to be an absolutely historic day for you. The entire financial world will be watching exactly what happens when you step up to that podium. I hope you have your speech perfectly memorized. The investors are going to hang on every single word you say about the technology." Richard frowned slightly, his thick brow furrowing. My reaction was completely wrong. His narcissistic brain could not compute why the supposedly broken woman on the sidewalk was smiling at him like she knew a secret he did not. He expected tears or, at the very least, bitter rage. My absolute serenity unnerved him, even if he was too proud to consciously admit it. "Just make sure you watch the morning news, loser," Richard snapped, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction under the weight of my calm, unwavering stare. "I want you to see exactly what you lost. I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your miserable life." "I would not miss your big day for the world, Richard," I promised softly, holding his gaze until he was the one who finally broke eye contact and looked away. "I will be right there to see it all unfold." Richard scoffed, shaking his head, as if trying to clear away a sudden, uncomfortable sense of dread that had crept into his perfectly planned morning. He rolled up the tinted window, slammed his foot on the accelerator, and sped away, the tires screeching aggressively against the cold asphalt. I stood on the curb for a moment, watching his taillights disappear into the heavy morning traffic. He was driving incredibly fast, rushing headlong toward the very cliff I had meticulously carved out for him. I turned on my heel, adjusted my bag, and descended the concrete stairs into the subway station. The trap was perfectly set. The final hours were ticking down, and it was time to meet my lawyers to prepare the guillotine. I emerged from the subway into the towering concrete canyons of the financial district. The morning rush hour was in full swing, a sea of tailored suits and briefcases moving urgently along the sidewalks. I blended in perfectly as a face in the crowd, wrapping my cheap coat tight against the wind. But as I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of a massive glass skyscraper and stepped into the hushed marble-lined lobby, my posture completely changed. I bypassed the main reception desk and took the private executive elevator directly to the 45th floor. The doors opened to the pristine, imposing offices of Ms. Carmichael's law firm. She was waiting for me in a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. It looked like a military war room. 3 senior litigators, a forensic accountant, and 2 paralegals were already seated around a long mahogany table covered in thick binders and glowing laptops. "Right on time, Sophia," Ms. Carmichael said, gesturing to the empty leather chair at the head of the table. "Have a seat. We have a guillotine to sharpen." I sat down, shedding the worn coat, and immediately got to work. A senior litigator slid a thick stack of documents across the polished wood. "This is the finalized federal injunction," he explained, tapping the top page. "It is a masterpiece of corporate destruction." I scanned the legal jargon, my auditor brain absorbing the clauses. "What is the exact angle of attack?" I asked, needing to know every detail of the execution. Ms. Carmichael leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Richard submitted a Form S-1 registration statement to the Securities and Exchange Commission to take Montgomery PropTech public. In that federal document, he legally swore under penalty of perjury that his company owns the proprietary source code outright. He used that claim to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in commitments from institutional investors, but he does not own it. "We do," I finished, a cold satisfaction settling over me. "Exactly," the litigator chimed in. By attempting to sell shares of a company based on a core technological asset he secretly transferred to an offshore shell, which we have just legally acquired. Richard is no longer just a bad husband. He is actively committing massive, multi-million-dollar securities fraud. The moment he steps up to that podium and offers those shares to the public, he is defrauding the global financial market. Ms. Carmichael pushed a sleek silver tablet toward me. We are not just stopping the public offering, Sophia. We are tearing it down from the inside out. 30 minutes ago, we submitted a formal whistleblower complaint directly to the Enforcement Division of the SEC. We provided them with the complete Cayman Islands ownership registry, the transfer logs you recovered from DeAndre's flash drive, and the definitive proof that your Delaware proxy fund is the sole legal proprietor of the predictive valuation algorithm. I looked at the screen. It displayed a confirmation receipt from the federal government. The gears of the highest financial authority in the country were already turning. What happens next? I asked, my voice steady. We have a federal judge standing by in chambers right now, Ms. Carmichael answered, her eyes locked onto mine. Because of the sheer magnitude of the impending fraud and the immediate threat to public investors, the judge is preparing to sign an emergency ex parte order. It is an immediate, non-negotiable injunction, halting the initial public offering. She handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. But the SEC enforcement agents need a verified complainant on record before they raid a high-profile Wall Street event. They need the legal owner of the technology to formally declare the theft. You need to sign the final affidavit, Sophia. This is the point of no return. Once your name is on this document, Richard will know exactly who destroyed him. I took the heavy pen in my hand. I thought about the freezing nights in my repossessed car. I thought about the $100 bill Richard threw at my face. I thought about my mother slapping me and my sister laughing as I scrubbed red wine off the floor. They had all traded my humanity for a piece of a fabricated empire. I pressed the gold nib against the thick parchment and signed my name with absolute, unwavering precision. The trap is officially armed, Ms. Carmichael declared, taking the document and handing it to a paralegal who practically sprinted out of the room to file it electronically. The federal marshals have been dispatched, the senior litigator confirmed, checking his phone. They are coordinating with the SEC agents. They will meet us at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel ballroom in exactly 2 hours. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the crawling traffic of Wall Street far below. Richard was down there somewhere, surrounded by sycophantic assistants, adjusting his tie, fully believing he was about to ascend to the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. He had spent months constructing a perfect, invincible illusion. It was finally time to show him what reality looked like. The Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was transformed into a cathedral of modern capitalist excess. Sunlight streamed through the towering arched windows, catching the reflection of a dozen crystal chandeliers and casting fractured light across the ornate carpets. At the center of the main stage, a massive digital display board dominated the room, currently glowing with a countdown timer, waiting to flash the Montgomery PropTech ticker symbol the exact second the market opened. A highly polished brass bell hung from a heavy mahogany stand, ready for Richard to strike it and signal the beginning of public trading. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of Wall Street elites, venture capitalists, and financial reporters holding microphones and adjusting camera lenses. Waiters circulated flawlessly through the crowd with silver trays of complimentary mimosas, premium coffee, and imported caviar. The air practically buzzed with the electric, intoxicating frequency of impending wealth. Everyone in the room believed they were about to witness the birth of the next massive technology unicorn. Richard held court near the podium, surrounded by a dense swarm of sycophantic assistants and camera crews. He looked like the absolute king of the world in his custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled. He laughed loudly, clapping major investors on the back and delivering practiced, arrogant sound bites to the financial news networks about his unparalleled vision and relentless work ethic. Brittany clung tightly to his arm, wearing a blindingly white designer dress, actively making sure the television cameras caught the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. Standing just a few feet away, sipping a mimosa with an expression of supreme satisfaction, was Preston, his lead corporate attorney. Preston looked incredibly smug, mentally calculating his massive seven-figure commission for pushing the deal through the regulatory tape. He had completely forgotten about the critical cease and desist notice he had buried under a stack of receipts the night before, perfectly secure in his arrogant belief that nothing could derail this massive financial train. Directly in the front row, seated in reserved chairs sectioned off by thick velvet ropes, sat my family. They had fully leaned into their fabricated identities as the wealthy elite. Beatrice was wearing a pink designer suit that I knew for a fact was purchased on the high-interest credit card tied to their newly signed second mortgage. Winston wore a pristine tuxedo, his chest puffed out proudly, aggressively shaking hands with any wealthy-looking person who walked by. Olivia sat next to them, draped in expensive silk and newly purchased pearls, desperately trying to look like she belonged among the billionaires. DeAndre was noticeably absent from the celebration. After Richard threatened him with federal prison in the parking garage, he had likely gone into hiding, leaving his wife completely ignorant of their mutual financial ruin and his impending legal doom. A young reporter from a major financial broadcast network approached their row, holding a microphone with a bright red logo. "Are you the family of the founder?" the reporter asked politely, signaling her cameraman to start recording. Beatrice practically shoved Olivia out of the way to get her face fully on camera. "Oh, absolutely," Beatrice beamed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and practiced charm. "We are Richard's original backers. We recognized his absolute genius from the very beginning. We have invested our entire life savings into this public offering because we firmly believe in family supporting family." Winston leaned eagerly into the camera frame, unable to contain his greed. "We secured a massive block of pre-public offering shares," he bragged proudly, completely oblivious to the fact that he was proudly admitting to reckless financial behavior on national television. "By noon today, our family portfolio is going to triple in value. Richard is practically a son to us." The massive digital clock suspended above the stage ticked down relentlessly. 5 minutes to the opening bell, the financial anchors on the broadcasting platforms began wrapping up their preliminary segments, turning their full, undivided attention to the podium. The low roar of the crowd shifted into a unified, breathless anticipation. Institutional investors adjusted their ties and gripped their smartphones, ready to execute their massive buy orders, the absolute second the bell rang. A stage manager wearing a black headset pointed a finger at Richard and gave him a sharp nod. It was time. Richard kissed Brittany affectionately on the cheek, straightened his lapels, and confidently walked up the carpeted steps to the center stage. The room erupted into a deafening, echoing round of applause. My parents stood up, clapping aggressively and cheering his name at the top of their lungs. Richard picked up the heavy wooden mallet, resting it carefully against his palm. He looked out over the sea of eager faces, a predatory, triumphant smile locked onto his features. He was exactly 60 seconds away from securing his stolen billionaire status, completely and utterly blind to the absolute devastation waiting just on the other side of the heavy mahogany ballroom doors. The giant digital clock suspended above the stage ticked down relentlessly. 45 seconds. The low hum of the ballroom faded into absolute breathless silence. Institutional investors stared unblinking at the stage. Financial reporters adjusted their earpieces, ready to broadcast the exact moment Montgomery PropTech became a publicly traded titan. Richard raised the heavy wooden mallet high into the air, his eyes locked onto the gleaming brass bell. He took a deep, theatrical breath, soaking in the absolute adoration of the crowd. He was untouchable. 30 seconds. A sudden, echoing boom shattered the pristine silence of the ballroom. It was not the crisp ring of the ceremonial bell. It was the violent, heavy sound of the massive mahogany double doors at the back of the hall being shoved forcefully open. The doors hit the wall with a cracking thud that made several wealthy investors in the back rows physically jump. Every single head in the room, including the television cameras, snapped away from the stage and turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold and into the blinding light of the chandeliers. I was no longer the shivering, broken woman sleeping in a repossessed sedan. I was certainly no longer the invisible catering waitress sweeping up shattered glass. I was wearing a $10,000 midnight black Tom Ford suit, tailored with lethal precision to project absolute authority. A pair of flawless, minimalist diamond studs rested in my ears, catching the light with every step. My hair was sleek, my posture was perfect, and I radiated the terrifying, quiet luxury of a woman who completely owned the room. But I did not walk in alone. Flanking my right side was Ms. Carmichael, her expression carved from stone, clutching a thick black leather briefcase. Flanking my left and fanning out directly behind me were 4 federal marshals. They wore dark tactical windbreakers, their gold federal badges prominently displayed on their belts, their hands resting casually but deliberately near their holstered weapons. The atmosphere in the ballroom instantly transformed from a celebratory gala into a crime scene. The sea of wealthy elites, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle. Nobody dared to speak. The only sound in the massive hall was the sharp, rhythmic click of my designer heels striking the polished marble floor. As I walked down the center aisle, I kept my eyes locked directly on the stage. But in my peripheral vision, I saw my family seated in the front row. Their reactions were a masterpiece of absolute shock. Beatrice actually dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered quietly on the thick carpet, spilling premium liquor over her expensive shoes, but she did not even notice. Her jaw was completely unhinged, staring at my tailored suit and the federal agents guarding my back. Olivia looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her eyes darted frantically from my diamond earrings to the federal badges, her brain completely short-circuiting as she tried to comprehend how the sister she mocked yesterday was now commanding a private army. Winston slowly sank back into his velvet chair, his face draining of all color as a sudden horrific realization began to claw at his greedy mind. 15 seconds. The digital clock continued to flash behind Richard, but it was completely meaningless now. Richard stood frozen at the podium. The heavy wooden mallet was still suspended awkwardly in the air. For a fleeting second, his carefully constructed mask of arrogant confidence completely shattered, revealing the panicked, confused coward underneath. He blinked rapidly, staring at my transformation. His brain could not reconcile the destitute woman he had taunted on the street with the corporate titan currently marching toward his stage. But his narcissism quickly kicked in, masking his panic with a flash of intense defensive rage. He slammed the mallet down onto the wooden podium, intentionally missing the bell, and grabbed the microphone. "Security!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing sharply through the sound system, cracking slightly under the pressure. "We have an unauthorized trespasser. Remove this woman from the ballroom immediately." 3 large, broad-shouldered men in private hotel security uniforms stepped forward from the shadows of the stage, moving to intercept me, but they did not make it past the first step. The lead federal marshal simply raised his hand, pointing a single leather-gloved finger at the hotel guards. "Stand down," the marshal ordered, his voice echoing without the need for a microphone. "This is a federal operation. Interfere, and you will be arrested for obstructing justice." The private security guards instantly froze. They looked at the gold federal badges, looked back at Richard, and immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. They were paid to bounce rowdy drunks, not to engage the United States government. I reached the base of the stage and stopped. I stood exactly 5 feet away from the podium, looking up at Richard. The countdown clock behind him silently hit 0. The market was officially open, but the brass bell remained entirely silent. Richard's breathing turned ragged, his knuckles pale as he clutched the edges of the podium. He stared down at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mix of fury and fear. Across the world, millions were watching the live broadcast, waiting to see what the woman in the Tom Ford suit would do next. Richard slammed his fist against the polished mahogany podium, the sharp crack echoing through the silent ballroom. He jabbed a trembling finger toward me, his polished CEO image falling apart beneath the harsh glare of the television lights. "I don't care who these people say they are," Richard shouted, spittle flying from his mouth as he glared at the hotel security staff retreating toward the exit. "I paid for this venue. This is a private corporate event. Throw her out into the street immediately, or I'll make sure none of you ever work in this city again." The lead federal marshal did not even flinch. Resting one hand on his utility belt, he climbed the short staircase to the stage. His heavy boots struck the carpeted floor with dull thuds, each one seeming to drain the remaining air from the room. He stopped inches from Richard, towering over him. "Mr. Montgomery," the marshal said in a deep, gravelly voice that sliced through the microphone feedback, "you are currently obstructing a federal mandate. Raise your voice at my agents again, and I will place you in handcuffs in front of millions of viewers. Step away from the bell." Richard recoiled instantly, his arrogant confidence replaced by pure animal fear. He staggered backward, nearly losing his balance at the edge of the stage, leaving the ceremonial bell untouched. Ms. Carmichael calmly followed the marshal up the stairs. She opened her black leather briefcase and removed a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the bright red seal of the United States District Court. Instead of handing them over, she dropped the heavy papers directly onto the podium, covering Richard's prepared speech. "Richard Montgomery," Ms. Carmichael announced, turning slightly so the news cameras captured her clearly. "You have been officially served with a federal emergency injunction issued by the United States District Court and the Securities and Exchange Commission. This initial public offering is suspended effective immediately." In the VIP section, my father Winston jumped from his velvet chair. "What is she talking about?" Winston shouted, panic cracking his voice. "What injunction? Let him ring the bell. We bought pre-IPO shares." Preston, Richard's expensive corporate attorney, suddenly forced his way through the crowd. His face had gone ghostly pale, beads of nervous sweat running down his temples. He rushed onto the stage and snatched the court documents. His eyes moved frantically across the front page. I watched him read the exact Cayman Islands shell company name he had arrogantly dismissed the previous night. His knees buckled, and the papers slipped from his hands as if they were on fire. I turned away from the stage and faced the crowd. Standing only a few feet from me was a senior correspondent from a major financial news network. He stared at me in stunned silence, still holding out his microphone. I reached over and gently took it from his hand. He offered no resistance. I faced the sea of institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and my completely horrified family. "Good morning, Wall Street," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the live broadcast. "My name is Sophia Hartfield. I am the former wife of Richard Montgomery. More importantly, I am the lead architect and original developer of the predictive valuation software that Montgomery PropTech claims to own." A heavy gasp swept across the ballroom. Hundreds of phones lit up instantly as investors began furiously messaging their trading desks. "Yesterday afternoon," I continued, my voice calm and unwavering, "legal ownership of the Cayman Islands holding company containing that proprietary source code was transferred to a Delaware proxy fund under my exclusive control. Richard Montgomery moved those assets into an offshore shell company months ago in an attempt to conceal them during our divorce proceedings. By doing so, he legally stripped his own company of its primary technological asset. I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle over the room. Then I looked directly into the main television camera. Therefore, the S-1 prospectus filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission is fraudulent. Richard Montgomery is attempting to sell you equity in an empty shell. He does not own the code. He does not own the algorithm. He does not own the future of real estate technology. I do, and I have permanently revoked his licensing rights. The silence afterward felt crushing. Then the ballroom erupted into complete chaos, furious shouting from hedge fund managers mixed with desperate questions from financial reporters, creating a deafening wall of noise. But I did not remain frozen in place. I turned my back on the panicked crowd and walked directly toward the audiovisual control station beside the stage. The technician behind the mixing board stared at me wide-eyed, but made no move to stop me once the federal marshals secured the area. I removed a sleek silver cable from my pocket and plugged it into my encrypted tablet, overriding the main video feed. Above the stage, the massive digital display flickered. The Montgomery PropTech logo and IPO countdown clock vanished instantly. In their place appeared a crisp, high-definition document, the official corporate registry issued by the Cayman Islands government. I raised the microphone again, my voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Please direct your attention to the screen," I instructed, my tone filled with complete authority. The room slowly quieted as hundreds of wealthy investors lifted their eyes toward the display, desperate for answers. "What you are looking at is the true architectural foundation of this company," I explained while slowly walking across the front of the stage. 6 weeks before Richard Montgomery filed for divorce, he carried out a secret corporate restructuring. He took the predictive valuation source code, the exact technology he stood here and claimed to have created, and quietly sold it. He transferred the perpetual intellectual property rights to an anonymous offshore shell corporation called Apex Global Holdings. I tapped my tablet screen. The massive display shifted instantly, revealing the internal transfer records and the original bill of sale recovered from DeAndre's flash drive. A wave of disbelief swept through the front rows as the institutional investors studied the numbers. "He sold the core asset of his own company for exactly $1, I said, allowing the absurdity of the scheme to sink in. "He did this to artificially bankrupt Montgomery PropTech on paper so I would receive nothing during our divorce settlement. He committed perjury during asset division proceedings, and he lied to every venture capitalist in this room." Richard finally found his voice. "It's a lie," he shouted, gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. "She fabricated those documents. I own the technology. Do not listen to a bitter ex-wife." I ignored his desperate outburst and tapped my tablet again. The screen switched to the final, devastating piece of evidence, the court-ordered debt-for-equity swap approved by the Grand Court of the Cayman Islands. Richard was so obsessed with hiding his wealth that he forgot to pay the annual maintenance fees for his offshore shell company. I continued, my voice cold and precise. The entity fell into bad standing. Yesterday afternoon, my proxy fund legally acquired the outstanding debt of Apex Global Holdings and executed a hostile asset seizure. The Cayman courts approved the transfer. I am now the sole legal owner of the intellectual property. I pointed directly at Richard. He cannot take this company public because he has absolutely nothing left to sell you except empty office furniture and a fraudulent prospectus. The ballroom completely exploded. The silence shattered beneath a tidal wave of furious shouting and panic. Men in expensive tailored suits hurled their champagne glasses onto the floor while frantically screaming into their phones, ordering their trading desks to cancel every pending purchase immediately. The anchor investors, Men who had already wired millions into the pre-IPO offering surged toward the stage with rage burning across their faces, demanding their money back. Preston, the lead corporate attorney, realized in that moment his career was finished. He backed away from Richard, shaking his head violently. "You lied to us," Preston shouted over the chaos. "You swore the technology was held in-house. You made us submit a fraudulent federal filing. Richard, we're done. Effective immediately, my firm is withdrawing as your legal counsel." Without another word, Preston turned and nearly ran off the stage, abandoning his client completely. Richard stood alone behind the wooden podium. He stared out at the furious investors, the flashing press cameras, and the federal agents moving steadily into position. The empire he built on stolen code and deception had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. He tried to bury me in darkness, but he forgot that pressure creates diamonds. I stood motionless, calmly watching the destruction of the man who had tried to ruin my life forever. The lead federal marshal lowered his hand, signaling the 2 Securities and Exchange Commission agents to move forward. They advanced with calm, practiced precision, ignoring the chaos consuming the ballroom. Richard stumbled backward until his back struck the massive digital display, still showing my Cayman Islands ownership documents. The lead agent identified himself and informed Richard he was being detained for questioning regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, perjury, and multi-million-dollar securities fraud. He instructed Richard to place his hands where they could be seen. Richard looked down at his trembling hands as the heavy ceremonial mallet slipped from his grip and crashed onto the wooden stage. The sharp crack of the mallet hitting the floor seemed to break the final illusion holding the room together. The Wall Street bankers and institutional investors did not simply leave. They evacuated as though the building itself were on fire. Men in bespoke suits shoved past one another, shouting into their phones to terminate every trade associated with Montgomery PropTech. Financial reporters at the back of the ballroom practically screamed into their microphones, broadcasting the collapse of the decade live to millions of viewers. The grand ballroom, moments earlier a cathedral of wealth and arrogance, was rapidly emptying, leaving behind toppled chairs and spilled champagne across the floor. The IPO was officially dead before the opening bell ever rang. Richard struggled weakly as the agent secured his arms. His commanding voice had completely disappeared. He begged them to listen, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. He claimed he still had the capital to restructure. He desperately tried to convince them he was a visionary. The federal agents ignored every word. They calmly turned him around and began reading him his rights, their flat professional voices clashing sharply against his growing panic. Richard looked desperately across the rapidly emptying ballroom, searching for someone, anyone, who could save him. His eyes finally landed on Preston, but the attorney was already disappearing through the double doors without a single glance backward, abandoning his client to save himself. Then Richard looked toward the front row. Brittany stood frozen in the middle of the chaos. The color had drained entirely from her deeply tanned face. She looked at the federal agents holding Richard, then slowly lifted her eyes to the massive screen displaying my legal ownership of the company. The illusion of her perfect billionaire future was collapsing right in front of her. She finally understood the truth. She was not marrying a brilliant tech visionary. She was marrying a bankrupt felon who was about to spend the next decade in a federal prison. Richard tried to move toward Brittany, dragging one of the agents with him. His voice overflowed with desperation as he begged her to listen. He pleaded with her to call her wealthy father and ask his venture capital firm to wire emergency bail money. He promised he could still fix everything if her father would just cover the financial gap long enough for him to sue me. Brittany stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the full scale of his deception finally sank in. "You lied to me," she whispered hoarsely. "You lied to my father. You don't own everything. You don't have $1 billion. Her voice cracked as realization hit her. You don't even have a real company." Tears of humiliation welled in her eyes, smearing her expensive makeup down her face. Slowly, she looked at the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. The ring purchased with money generated by the company I created. The same ring Richard used to display her like a trophy. With one violent motion, Brittany ripped the ring from her hand. "You are pathetic," she spat, her voice filled with disgust. She hurled the heavy diamond directly at his chest. It struck the lapel of his tailored suit, bounced off, and rolled across the stage until it stopped near my designer heels. Brittany never looked back. She spun around, gathered the skirt of her blinding white designer dress, and stormed down the center aisle. Pushing past the remaining guests, she sobbed openly as she fled the wreckage of the man she almost married. Richard watched her disappear, his mouth hanging open in silent devastation. The trophy wife, the billionaire image, the admiration of Wall Street. Gone. The federal agents firmly guided him down the stage steps, leaving him with absolutely nothing. As Richard was escorted through the heavy mahogany doors, the flashes of the press cameras followed him out, transforming the once grand ballroom into a hollow shell of destruction. Federal marshals began packing their briefcases while the remaining investors rushed for the exits, screaming into their phones in a desperate attempt to limit their losses. I remained perfectly still, my tablet resting securely in my hand, calmly watching the dust settle over my total victory. But I was not finished yet. I turned toward the VIP section. Winston, Beatrice, and Olivia had not moved at all. They sat frozen in their velvet chairs, crushed beneath the suffocating weight of their own greed. Above the stage, the giant digital screen still displayed my legal ownership of the company, undeniable proof that the pre-IPO shares they had purchased were worthless. They had traded their futures for pieces of a phantom empire. Winston was the first to break. A guttural gasp escaped his throat as he clutched his chest, looking moments away from collapse. The second mortgage on his pristine colonial home. His liquidated retirement portfolio. The brutal early withdrawal penalties he willingly paid. Gone. At nearly 70 years old, he was now facing irreversible bankruptcy. Beside him, Beatrice sat speechless, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The expensive pink designer suit she wore suddenly looked absurd, a symbol of the crushing credit card debt she would never repay. Olivia was hyperventilating, gripping her new pearl necklace so tightly the strand looked ready to snap. She had forged DeAndre's signature and drained their joint savings, destroying the last fragile remains of her marriage. Then panic took over. Beatrice burst into tears and stumbled out of her chair. Winston and Olivia followed close behind, nearly tripping over the velvet ropes as they rushed across the empty ballroom toward me. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, forming a protective wall between us. I raised one hand slightly, signaling them to stand down. "Sophia!" Beatrice cried, makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "Please, you have to help us. We didn't know. We had no idea he was lying." Winston shoved past her, sweat covering his flushed face. "You own the technology now, Sophia," he said frantically. "You're a multimillionaire. You can refund our investment. You can pay off the second mortgage before the bank forecloses. We're your family. We're your blood." Olivia suddenly dropped to her knees in front of me. The same shoes she once mocked were now directly in front of her tear-filled eyes. "I'm sorry," Olivia sobbed uncontrollably, reaching for the hem of my trousers. "I was horrible to you. I was jealous. Please, Sophia. I spent everything. I have nothing left." I looked down at all three of them and felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No guilt. That bond died the night they left me shivering alone in the rain outside their house. I looked directly at Beatrice. "You didn't know he was lying?" I repeated quietly, my voice turning ice cold. "I came to your house yesterday. I looked you in the eye and warned you that his company was built on lies. I begged you not to invest." I paused. And you slapped me across the face and threw me out of your house. You called me pathetic, jealous, vindictive. Beatrice flinched as if struck again. I was wrong, she cried through tears. I was so wrong. You made your choice, I replied, turning toward Winston. You told television reporters Richard was like a son to you. You chose the man who stole from me because you believed he could buy you a luxury retirement. You gambled your entire future on his arrogance, and you lost. I stepped backward, pulling away from Olivia's desperate grasp. I owe you nothing, I said calmly. If you want your money back, hire a lawyer and get in line behind the federal government. But since Richard is bankrupt and heading to prison, I would suggest looking for a small apartment to rent. Then I turned my back on them. Their screams and desperate apologies echoed through the shattered ballroom as I walked away with my head held high, leaving them to drown in the ruin they created with their own hands. The chaos inside the Waldorf Astoria ballroom continued behind me as I walked toward the heavy exit doors. The screaming investors, shattered champagne glasses, and weeping relatives were no longer my concern. I had destroyed every lie Richard built his empire upon. As I stepped into the quiet marble corridor, Ms. Carmichael moved beside me, her phone pressed to her ear. After listening silently for several moments, she lowered it and offered me a rare, genuine smile. The secondary strike just landed, Sophia, she said. The FBI raided DeAndre's real estate brokerage downtown. Thanks to the wire fraud evidence Richard kept on his own servers, they had enough probable cause for an immediate arrest warrant. DeAndre was handcuffed in front of his entire staff and taken into federal custody. He's facing decades for real estate fraud and corporate embezzlement. I nodded slowly, feeling a deep sense of closure settle inside me. DeAndre believed he could manipulate both sides. He thought he could profit from my destruction while blackmailing Richard at the same time. Now his fake designer watches and leased sports cars would be auctioned off by the government, while Olivia faced her massive debts alone. The house of cards had not simply collapsed. It had burned to the ground. When we reached the main hotel lobby, a crowd of curious guests and reporters had gathered near the revolving doors, held back by federal marshals. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the marble walls. I stopped beside a marble pillar and watched the SEC agents escort Richard toward the exit. He looked completely broken. The expensive charcoal suit now hung awkwardly from his frame. Heavy steel handcuffs secured his hands behind his back. The arrogant billionaire image had been stripped away entirely, revealing nothing except a terrified man watching his life collapse in real time. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance, camera flashes exploding nonstop to capture the downfall of Wall Street's golden tech visionary. Then Richard suddenly stopped. He twisted around frantically until his eyes found me standing near the marble pillar. His face contorted with rage and agony. "Sophia!" he screamed, his voice cracking violently. "You can't do this to me. I built this company. I'm a visionary. You're nothing without me." His screams echoed through the massive lobby. He fought against the agents trying desperately to move toward me. The marshals tightened their grip and forced him through the revolving doors. "Sophia!" he screamed one final time, his voice muffled by the thick glass as he was shoved into the back of a waiting armored federal SUV. The doors slammed shut. Seconds later, the vehicle sped away, sirens wailing into the Manhattan morning, carrying my ex-husband toward the prison cell he earned for himself. I turned away from the glass doors and stepped through the side exit onto the street. The cold New York air hit my face, but for the first time in years I no longer felt frozen. I inhaled deeply. Above the towering skyscrapers, the sky was perfectly blue. For the first time in over a decade, I was finally free. The divorce proceedings no longer mattered. Richard would spend the rest of his life buried beneath criminal charges and civil lawsuits from furious investors. He would never again have the power or resources to challenge my inheritance. The $68 million, the offshore holding company, and the proprietary technology were now completely and undeniably mine. A sleek black Maybach glided smoothly to the curb in front of me. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. "Right this way, Ms. Hartfield," he said respectfully. I turned toward Ms. Carmichael and extended my hand. "Thank you," I said simply. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Sophia," she replied warmly. "Enjoy your empire." I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. The door closed softly behind me, sealing away the noise of the city. Leaning back against the plush seat, I finally allowed the full magnitude of my victory to wash over me. I survived betrayal. I weaponized my pain. I outsmarted my abusers, and I reclaimed my worth. The car pulled away from the curb and merged smoothly into Manhattan traffic. As the city blurred past my tinted window, I realized something important. They could take my comfort. They could steal my trust. They could even try to destroy my life. But they could never take my mind. Sophia Hartfield's story is ultimately a lesson in patience, discipline, and quiet strategic power. When people betray us, the natural instinct is to react emotionally. We want to scream, fight, and force the world to recognize our pain. Sophia chose something far more dangerous: control. She understood that greedy, arrogant people eventually destroy themselves if given enough rope. Richard's downfall was not caused by luck. It was the inevitable consequence of his own fraud, ego, and recklessness. Her family's collapse was also self-inflicted. Their greed blinded them to every warning sign. Sophia never needed to shout to win. She gathered leverage. She waited patiently. And when the perfect moment arrived, she removed every safety net beneath them all at once. True power does not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the person disciplined enough to hold their strongest cards until the exact right moment to play them. We cannot always control the cruelty of others, but we can control how we rebuild ourselves after betrayal. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is becoming impossible to destroy.